have these horrible things. I hate these things. Why can't we have a time? It's like a hot. That's this horrible thing which is made for people with huge heads. What?
You see what happens? I always dreamt of being Mr. Spock.
Yes, well
but
now you
never
are.
like this. Well, I get pointy ears, that's for sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session on Venezuela in Crisis. My name is Lindsay Hilsum. I'm the international editor of Channel 4 News. I was in Venezuela week before last. I spent about a week, 10 days there. I only ever agree to do these sessions if I'm going to learn something. And I looked at the panel, I thought, yep, I'm definitely going to learn something. So I'm very happy to introduce Vladimir Hernandez from the BBC and Oscar Guardiola Rivera from Birkbeck College. Vladimir here has been going backwards and forwards to Venezuela, which is his home country, reporting for the BBC since 2014. And Oscar, you were there just last week, as I understand it. And I'm hoping we're going to also be joined by Ana Vanessa Herrera, who is from the New York Times, and she, I hope, is going to join us from Caracas. In the meantime, let me just say something. I mean, you've been seeing these photographs, I think, which have been going up there, which are just extraordinary, which we saw in the New Yorker earlier this week with a text by John Lee Anderson, an eminent member of this club and who is a great expert on Venezuela, has been going backwards and forwards for many years. And these photographs are by Alejandro Segarra. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them, his notes on them, because I think that they tell us something. He writes, I grew up seeing Hugo Chavez in the TV. I still remembered like it was a couple of hours ago when he died of cancer, leaving an orphan revolution. His presidency had the biggest economic boom of Venezuela's history, making it easy to fund his dream of a more equal, safer, and less poor Venezuela. But 4 years after his death, Venezuela is less equal, more dangerous, and poorer than ever. And I think that concept of an orphan revolution is a very telling one. Ana Vanessa, can you hear us?
Yes, hi.
Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you very much for joining us from Caracas. I'm going to turn first to our two guests here and ask them to give us a minute each on the main point which we need to understand about Venezuela today. And then I'm going to come to you, Ana Vanessa, to give us a bit of a sense of what's going on right now in Caracas. So let me go to you, Vladimir, first, since you are a Venezuelan. Just tell us what it's been like. You've been watching this decline and this pain, and your own family are there. Just tell us what that's like.
I think the main thing is that this probably is one of the most challenging sort of stories as a journalist I've had to go. I've done stories in different parts of the world, in different roles, but when the story hits you and hits your relatives on a regular basis, it becomes incredibly challenging. I used to go back to Venezuela on holidays. It's got amazing beaches and lovely food and all of that. Since probably 2013, 14, that all changed, and I normally now go back more for work than anything else. I buy flour in Tesco here, and I take it back to my mum because she doesn't have it. And then you go out and see people who are in an incredibly dire situation. As everything we've seen in recent days and probably weeks or since the turn of this year, it all seems to be, the narrative is now ideology, socialism is failing, capitalism, Trump, Maduro, Guaido, all of these people. But I can tell you, I've seen with my own eyes and see it on a regular basis with my family, that the real story here is that the Venezuelan people are just in a completely humanitarian catastrophe, and it's just an absolute meltdown. I've seen my mother lose 20 kilos in 2 years, for instance, and I support her. And even without that, I mean, she probably wouldn't be around. So I can just tell you that from my perspective, this is a complete humanitarian disaster. 3 million people have left the country, and it's beyond ideology.
Beyond ideology. Oscar, give us in 1 minute your perspective on that idea. It's beyond ideology.
Well, today, Latin American media reporting that yesterday Vice President Mike Pence presented the President of Colombia, Ivan Duque, the self-proclaimed interim President of Venezuela, Juan Guaidó, and Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro with 3 options, all of them containing an element of the use of force, and demand of them that they man up and choose one among them. Now, he had done this back in 2018, and in fact this is consistent with what The Guardian and other media have been telling us about Trump having set on a casus belli before the humanitarian crisis became visible. Now that should put to rest the argument that the champions of democracy and human rights, that is to say Mr. John Bolton, Mr. Elliot Abrams, and Donald J. Trump, are doing whatever it is they are doing out of the goodness of their heart and their interest in the real humanitarian crisis that does exist in Venezuela. That's not the case. This demonstrates that. And of course, what we now have is a situation in which Latin America is being bullied into going into a war that they don't want, that no one in Venezuela, particularly not those who oppose Maduro, want. A war that would only make worse the suffering of Venezuelans.
Thank you, Oscar. Ana Vanessa, let me turn to you. You were working for the New York Times. Now, obviously, over the weekend, you were reporting what was happening down on the border with the opposition and the Americans trying to force aid across, and there was a standoff there. Tell us what's happening now. What are you reporting at the moment?
Well, I wasn't at the border on the weekend. I was reporting in Caracas because most journalists were actually at the border, so someone had to watch the capital. Although nothing really big happened, if something happened, then the capital would have been a major point for journalists to be covering. So I decided to stay here, and right now, and it is interesting what I got to see, because even though nothing happened, the capital stayed rarely quiet. It is very tense situation right now. I don't know how to explain it, but it is tense, but still nothing is happening. So it's what in Spanish we call tensa calma, like a calmly, really tense, calm situation. And it's still the same. We are just waiting for Juan Guaidó to come to Venezuela. That's the next big thing. How is Juan Guaidó going to come into Venezuela again? How is he going to make it? What's going to happen to him after he comes to Venezuela? He's going to get arrested. The next logical step would be that, because let's not forget that the Supreme Court said that he was not allowed to leave the country, and yet he has been for the past 4 days in between Cucuta and Bogota. So it is very tense, although nothing is happening, but we're waiting. We're like most people in Venezuela. We're just waiting to see what's going to happen.
So let me ask you, when I was there, we were all waiting. I went rushing out thinking, oh my God, everything's going to change. And of course, nothing changed and everything changed, because you have this sort of build-up of pressure. And you have Juan Guaidó, who, as you in the audience will know, declared himself president and has now got the backing of the Americans, the British, lots of people saying he is the president. Well, he's not actually the president. Maduro is the president. I'm the Queen of Sheba. You can say
but
you are.
Oh,
I am. Sorry, and I am. So it's the sort of force of saying that you are something when you're not, and what that does or what it means. But you have demonstrations all the time, Ana Vanessa, and you say it's tense but calm. In the barrios, what is the feeling in the barrios? Because when I was there, I got a sense of people really turning against the government and being angry, and also being killed if they went out to protest, unlike the middle class when they go out to protest in the town.
Well, in the barrios, they get killed either if they protest or not. That's, basically how everyone in Venezuela is living right now because of insecurity. So this is not something that's a shock for anyone who lives in a slum in Venezuela, in a barrio in Venezuela. And you know, it's not a surprise to anyone that lives in Venezuela anymore. But yeah, I mean, in the barrios, definitely things change. This is not the same thing as we saw in 2017. For example, 2014, where a huge protest started against Nicolas Maduro. We saw mostly back then middle class protesting, very strong and big protests though, but still always middle class, and barrios and lower classes were just either not going to protest because they didn't feel identified in this group. But right now things are completely different. Actually, everything started, I mean, this whole thing started because of an uprising in Capia, which is a very poor neighborhood, a barrio, between a poor neighborhood and a barrio. And they started there, and that says a lot of what we're looking at right now. And I love the way that you said, you know, nothing is changing, but everything changed, because that is exactly what is happening. Nothing is changing because, of course, in the eyes of everyone that's looking from outside, it's either Maduro or not Maduro anymore. That's the change. But for the ones who have been covering Venezuela, living here, have family members here, we know that everything changed since past January. So right now, we don't really know what's going to happen, of course, but I always say there's no way of coming back. You know, there's no way this is going to be the same country as we saw it in January 2019. I mean, and this a month and a half before. And it's either, I mean, the government is either going to change completely, openly show themselves as they are, or there is actually going to be some huge change, meaning I don't know if Juan Guaidó or anyone else is going to take over the presidency.
Okay, let me turn it back to the panel here. Oscar, I'm interested with this idea that Vladimir had about beyond ideology, because when I was there, certainly in the barrios, I interviewed a woman who had been a real Chavista, a real supporter of Chavez, and she was now, she couldn't feed her children, and she was, well, you know what? You can't eat socialism, and I don't care. I want this aid, and I don't care if it's Yankee imperialist aid. I just want aid. What would you say to her?
Well, when you talk to people in 23 de Enero or in La Comunal Maizal, they tell you two things. First, Chavez isn't the revolution. Maduro isn't the revolution. The Bolivarian revolution predates both of them. They became the expression of the revolution, but they are not identifiable with the revolution. So they will tell you that the process of the Bolivarian revolution will remain even after they're gone. The second thing they will tell you...
I have to say, nobody told me that apart from the ideologues.
The second thing...
The ordinary people who were worried about what to eat and where to get antibiotics for were not telling me about the theory of the revolution.
Well, these are not ideologues. These are peasants in Comunal Maizal. These are people who felt
in
empowered
comunas and colectivos.
In comunas.
In
Not colectivos, in comunas.
In comunas. So these are the communes which were built up and which were supposed to be a new way of living.
Correct.
And of making a living.
But now,
if
I may, what they will tell you is that they are not necessarily in agreement or defending Maduro. They will be fiercely critical of Maduro. I witnessed a meeting in 23 de Enero, not a comuna, no ideologues there, but the people you're talking about, between them and the mayor of Caracas. And they were fiercely critical and very real and very pragmatic about what is happening. Of course, they will say exactly what you said. I need to feed my children. I won't eat words. I won't eat ideology. Now, they also know that the two things they want to avoid now is both the possibility of an even worse humanitarian crisis, the famine that might come if this more recent set of sanctions is allowed to run their course, but they also want to avoid the possibility of military intervention. Never underestimate the fact that Latin Americans, and this is not ideology, this is history, which is a force to be reckoned with. We know very well how is it like to live with our dear neighbors up there. We know that. Nobody in Latin America, not even those who are most critical of Maduro, people like Edgardo Lander in Venezuela, the other opposition whose voice we never heard in the media, because that's a real problem here. Guaidó is not the representative of the whole of the opposition. This is a wider, very varied, group.
Let me say, so, and basically, as people always used to say about Mexico, so far from God, so near to the United States. How does that strike you, Vladimir, when you're talking to people as you are every day? Do you get anxiety about the possibility of a US invasion, or are people like, hey, whatever?
I think there's a sense of despair, really. I think there's a sense of, if you see your neighbour's son who had a scrap in his knee and he couldn't find antibiotics and ended up dying in a hospital because of a simple scrap on a knee, let's say, and that's a real case that was published by Bloomberg a couple of years ago, then, well, I don't really care who's going to come. I just don't want to be in this position. It's one of the richest countries in the world in terms of oil and resources. And the fact that people in, I don't know, let's say in the last we're in 2019, in the last 9 years, people lost the option and the decision-making of, I want to go to a supermarket and buy that. That has not gone away in the last 2 years. I remember back in 2006, my in-laws were telling me, I now need to only find one brand of toilet paper because it's scarce. This is 2006, peak oil prices for Venezuela. People have lost, not only in the last few years, have lost in a decade the power to choose what they want.
And why
and let me just finish that point
yeah.
for 1 second.
Yeah.
Food distribution in 2 years or 3 years ago became monopolized by the state. People who can't go to supermarkets or can't buy because of hyperinflation were now given food by the state. That came every 2 weeks. And it's a bag of food which you can't choose what it is. It could be chicken one day, it could be soap.
Yeah.
So how can you then go somewhere and choose something? You've lost that. That thing, choosing what you want to buy, eat, feed yourself for your kids, is a huge thing. It's not about Trump. It's not about military coming in. It's not about the US. Most of the Venezuelan people right now, those who don't have money because of hyperinflation and all of that, don't have the power to choose what they want to buy to sustain themselves. Basic stuff.
But let me ask you, before I come back to you, Ana Vanessa, why is that? Because there are different versions of why that is. There's the government is corrupt, or the government is, but other people say, it's because of the sanctions. Tell me.
So, I know my colleague here, we were talking about this, and he will probably give
That's
his
fine,
view
you
of
can
events.
disagree, you can have a punch up, it's all good.
I know, that's what you people like.
That's what we like.
But I'm not a journalist, I'm just a humble
You're
academic.
not humble anything, but anyway, go on.
In the last year and a half,
Yes.
the Venezuelan government has been repeating that this is all the result of sanctions that impede us from getting our money and financial entities abroad and trying to buy the medicines that the people need. The economy in Venezuela crashed in 2014, much before the sanctions were applied. In 2014, there were big protests, and there were human rights abuses against some of the demonstrators. They were taken to the security service prison. They were tortured. The US government said, we're going to sanction some officials, not the economy, not the state's apparatus, not the entity. 2017, PDVSA for the first time, PDVSA is the national oil company, for the first time gets issued sanctions on what they're doing, and other entities like governors and mayors, etc. The economy had already crashed. This is not the result of sanctions, sorry. This is, when we're living in a world of Trump and fake news and all of that, this is not the result of sanctions. This economy had crashed already. We can go into ideology, we can go into does socialism work or not. Sure, that's another debate. But what happened here is not sanctions.
Okay, I'm going to
I'm sure you would agree with me that indeed the sanctions were not the cause of the crisis. The crisis was already happening. But of course the sanctions did compound the crisis, did make it worse. It isn't just the case that these were surgical sanctions targeting very precisely just the leadership. The problem with sanctions, with these kind of economic sanctions, and this is supported by at least two very different independent reports issued to and by the United Nations, is that they tend to affect the people who are already suffering rather than the leadership.
Well, hang on, let's be, and I'm going to put this to Ana Vanessa. So there's 100 individuals who are sanctioned. There were 7 to begin with, and then there's 100 for drug trafficking and for various things, and then there are sanctions on money laundering, on financial instruments. Ana Vanessa, from where you are, how does the sanctions argument? What impact do you think sanctions have had on the situation in Venezuela?
Well, the thing is that this happened, and this started way before the sanctions. This even started with Hugo Chavez. First, let's not forget about the main issue here. Sanctions may affect importation, but the fact that the government is importing basically every single good that Venezuelans consume tells you a lot about what's going on. And that happened way before. There is no national production. It fell and cracked down basically in 2012. In 2014, no, 2015, no, that was 2000. Sorry, that was 2014. Former minister said publicly, former minister of Chavez said publicly that $20 billion from Cadivi, which is was the state company that controlled the U.S. the dollars, how the dollars got distributed among the different people who wanted to buy them. Because we have control of the currency here in Venezuela. So $20 billion got lost. No one knows where they are. And that happened before the sanctions. And no one did anything about it. And, you know, something like that is happening every single day. 2015 was the last year, I'm just writing down some ideas. 2015 was the last year when we could really see what was going on in each ministry, because accountability stopped being published after 2015, after the National Assembly was taken by the opposition leaders, well, the opposition members. So no one really knows. And when you see, for example, the health accountability statement, you would get numbers so crazy and so unrealistic that it made basic major headlines in 2016. So all this chit chat is just to tell you that this is happening way before the sanctions. If the sanctions are doing something, they're just, you know, wiping out whatever was left from corruption and from all the shady businesses that the government was in way before, even with Hugo Chavez.
Lindsay, can I just add a quick point?
Yes, of course, and then I'll come back to you.
Today the narrative is sanctions. Sanctions are to blame. In 2012, 2010, it was the fall of oil prices. So there's always been a narrative. There's always an external narrative that is to blame.
Are you saying that the falling oil prices had no causal connection with what happened in Venezuela?
So there was a recent interview with the former head of the oil company, Rafael Ramirez, where he was talking about, Hugo Chavez asked me for $1 billion to create a fund to develop for the poor. He said, I didn't give him $1 billion, I gave him $100 billion. The decree of creation of that fund was, me, Hugo Chavez, the President of the Republic, will decide discretionary where that money will go and it will be spent. Those funds, that accountability was never published. So I cannot tell you right now for a fact that it was not oil, it was not sanctions, it's not all of that. But the unsustainability of policies have put us in this position where I've just spent a huge wealth. I'm not telling anyone where I spent it, and just, 6 months ago, you had someone in the US, a Venezuelan man, former official in the Ministry of Finance, be in charge for a $100 billion fraud. That is bigger than Odebrecht, which is supposed to be the biggest corruption scandal in the world. And this is one official. So there was a lot of money. Unsustainability is another issue here to talk about.
Okay, let me ask you to come back on that, Oscar. But I think basically what the other two are saying is that corruption, unaccountability, and just basically profligacy, which is never explained, is really what we're talking about. And the sanctions are really a minor thing beneath that. How would you respond?
Well, actually, those are the two competing narratives. There is a third narrative. And the third narrative has to do with Venezuela's historical dependence, exclusive dependence on oil. So you've had historically in Venezuela these cycles of up, down, and the dependence on the volatility of the oil market, as well as the geopolitics of the oil market, is precisely what causes the first cause of, or at least the contextual cause of these problems. If you add onto that mixture things that my colleagues have said, which are true. Of course there has been mismanagement. It is true that there has been corruption. Of course, this is not the first time that happens in Venezuela. I mean, Chavez didn't fall from the sky.
No, of course not.
There was something called El Caracazo. This golden era of Venezuela is something that we must also be very wary of, because of course El Caracazo did happen way before Chavez. It had nothing to do with Chavez. And these sorts of things have to do precisely with the volatility of oil markets.
But
Now, if you want to criticize the Bolivarian revolution, you may do so on the grounds that they were not able to break free from the dependence on oil. That is the problem.
Yes, that's the point. But other people would say that that is historical whataboutism. Historical whataboutism. Let me come to you. Anna Vanessa, yes, go ahead.
I don't think anyone right now is just criticizing the Bolivarian Revolution. I don't think that's the issue here. We're criticizing the fact that, the discussion is not about the revolution itself. It's about the mismanagement of this government, of Nicolás Maduro's government, that since 2014, he was incapable of doing anything for his own country. And this is the consequence of Hugo Chavez for sure. But this is not something this is not ideology we're talking about. These are facts. The facts that anywhere you go in Caracas, in Venezuela, you see people eating off the garbage. The fact that, for example, as my colleague was saying there, for example, for me, it touched very deeply. My best friend, 36 years old, he died because he didn't have any medicines. And we could get rich at medicine. We can buy the medicines, but we couldn't make it on time. We can bring them from the States on time. And this is one of the thousands of cases. And this has nothing to do with revolution. This has to do with facts and how it got up to here. And even when you go to the barrios, and this is something very different from 2017 and 14, and I think we were discussing this before, people in the barrios say, this has nothing, Nicolás Maduro has nothing to do with the revolution. No one can link, literally, genuinely, no one can link Nicolás Maduro and his government to the Bolivarian Revolution.
Lindsay, just a very quick point on oil dependency. In 2001, I was a reporter in one of the newspapers in Venezuela, and I was covering public finances. I remember very clearly, still to date, that you're looking at the accounts of the state, of the oil income, and it wasn't, the majority of the economy was not dependent on oil income. It was about 40% of the GDP. The rest of it was in between taxes, private companies, different bonds, mining in the deep south. The Venezuelan oil has always been this statement about Venezuela depends solely on oil. That's not true. That is not true. It became more and more dependent from 2003 probably onwards, after the coup, and Chavez got the oil company back and all of that stuff. All the way back to 2001, I would say it's about 40% of the GDP was dependent on oil.
So it became more dependent on oil, and why was that?
There's a huge oil influx in prices. All of that oil was done. And in the meantime, you have a president who's going down square saying, let's nationalize that building and that building and that building. And then price controls were imposed. And we can also argue, again, going back to ideology then, we could argue, yes, sure, there was an attempt to derail the revolution and to stop it and all of that stuff. But the policies and the measures taken to deal with whatever panorama there was economically or politically have led us to this position right now.
Oscar, I have to put that to you.
Look, I am not going to be painted here as some sort of fact denier or anything of the sort.
We're not trying to do that.
No, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is trying to provide context.
Yeah.
There is a historical context to what is happening in Venezuela. No, I'm not the first one to say that Venezuela's dependency on oil has been the basis of both its fortunes and its miseries. Venezuelan anthropologist Fernando Coronil published what is still, to date, the best account of politics in Venezuela. The title of that book says it all: The Magic of the State. The revenues come directly to the president. And of course, when you can decide, and this is not just Chavez, this is way before this, when you can decide where to put that money and so on and so forth, you produce forms of dependency and forms of oligopolies in the economy that will create this sort of situation, that will make it worse when the prices come down. And of course, if on top of that, your policies are flawed, lethargic, and very problematic, as my colleagues have very correctly pointed out, then what you have is the perfect toxicity. But it would be equally ideological to try and sell this as something that just happened just now. That kind of analysis, without context, is not useful. Not useful for concrete policy making.
Okay, so let us so I think we've had some different views on how we got to where we are. So let's look at where we're going next. So, Vladimir, Juan Guaido. There he is, 35 years old. I interviewed him the week before last. Looks a little bit like Obama. Terribly smooth, good speaker. There you are, answer to all your problems. What do you think?
Me and my friends joke, my friends who are basically all around the world because most of them left Venezuela,
Yeah.
we joke that this is one of the most stable crises in the world. And I'm still on the skeptical side. I just don't think, I wouldn't be surprised if Maduro is still in power in December, and my family will kill me if I say that, but I do think that so far we've got rhetoric, we've got pressure, the sanctions will indeed create an economic impact right now, but
These we're talking about the new sanctions which were imposed just 3 weeks ago.
On
but go
public
ahead.
entities, but beyond the war of words, I personally don't think there will be an invasion by the US. I personally don't think other countries are going to come in and do that. Other countries in the region are not interested in that. And there's no elections in place because the Electoral Council, and we can do a whole session on this, there's a whole problem with fair elections in Venezuela since last year. It's a stalemate.
You see it as a stalemate. Well,
and there's no reason for the government to resign because there's nowhere to go. Most of the top officials are wanted by the US or by Interpol on money laundering or drug charges or whatever, so where are they going to go?
So it's interesting. So Vladimir thinks that there is not going to be any kind of invasion. And you've been looking at this and you're telling us a bit at the beginning about this meeting in Lima. Tell us a bit more. What do you think?
Well, this is what happened, what came out of the Lima, the so-called Lima group meeting yesterday. It is now absolutely clear that the government of the United States demanded of the governments of Colombia and Brazil to choose one between three options, all of them involving the use of force, a military intervention. By the United States, but with either Brazil or Colombia doing the dirty job. And of course, this was immediately refused by both governments. This is where we are now. This is a new development. It's not what Washington wanted to hear. That's absolutely clear. Now the question is, why that was the reaction both in Colombia and Brazil? And let me tell you, this has nothing to do with the political leanings, and I know you don't like ideology, but it does matter. Take it from someone who has grown up in a country at war, and there are worse things that can happen.
Yes, Colombia. Yeah.
You know, everybody talks about 2.4 million Venezuelans coming into the forcibly displaced, and that's terrible. Imagine 7 million. That's exactly what we had in the last decade and a half in Colombia. Why? Ideology. The very same people who are now presenting themselves as the champions of democracy and human rights are the very same people who have killed 250,000 of their own citizens in Colombia, forcibly displaced 7 million, and disappeared 40,000 people. These are official figures. More than the combined number of the dictatorships of the Southern Cone. Now, are you going to believe that these people are going to act out of the goodness of their hearts? Certainly not. But of course, after a 60-year war, the Colombian army is exhausted of that, and they want nothing to do with yet another war. Also because, let's give due to military professionals. They do know what that kind of military intervention would look like in the geography and the geopolitics of Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil. This is, all these, pretend comparisons with Panama in the 80s are no good here, are totally useless. My take, and this is of course also what sources tell me, is that it is the army generals, the army officials, both in Brazil and Colombia, who have contained the far-right leanings of these two presidents. But it is absolutely clear that Washington wanted a war, and it wanted it way before the humanitarian cause was put together.
Okay, that's good. So let me come back to you, Ana Vanessa. How do you see this working out? I mean, do you see, from your sources and so on, a military intervention as likely, or do you see it as fading?
Well, I am not really sure how to answer that, but what I can tell you is that it was a shock, the fact that the military option was not actually an option on the Lima group. The fact that Peru started the Lima, the meeting, saying, this is not going to happen, it was a blow to the faces of every single opposition Venezuelan. In here, at least that's what I saw here in Caracas, and that's what I know from different sources inside of the Venezuelan opposition, because this is something that was already discussed. This is not something they were actually discussing yesterday. This was something that they were talking about, and that the government of the United States and that Juan Guaidó himself had, had tried to be subtle and not subtle at the same time about it. They were saying, and Juan Guaidó said it even on Sunday afternoon, late, early night, when he said, look, everything is on the table, all options are on the table. Of course, he was talking about military intervention. And, the fact that that didn't happen and that the aid couldn't come in on the weekend, it was a huge shock for the opposition, although we all knew this was not going to happen.
But let me interrupt you there, because it surprises me that it was a shock, because it seems to me that the opposition, I mean, when you looked at the situation and the forces ranged there on the border, it was highly unlikely that they were going to be able to get that aid across. So what does this tell us about the opposition? Are they dreaming? Are they smoking something? Are they, do they just have a sort of blind faith in the Americans that they can just do whatever the opposition wants?
I really don't want to be the person who justifies innocence here, because we're talking about a major crisis situation, humanitarian crisis that needs, people to be serious about it. But definitely, I do think they're humans, and I think the fact that they thought they were winning, was a disadvantage for them. And they actually, it's the same kind of reaction that we saw from the Venezuelan opposition before 2017, 2014, even when they won the National Assembly 2015-16. They started doing all this, quick steps on the agenda, and suddenly the government started following their agenda, and at one point they said, okay, we're winning. So they started to feel uncomfortable with themselves, and that's where the government just jumped in. Maybe it's the simplest way of explaining this. Of course, I mean, it's much more complicated than what I just explained, but it's a surface of what we're seeing here.
Lindsay, a quick point on Guaidó that you were saying.
Yeah.
I think if Guaidó becomes remembered for being the politician, president, or whatever you want to call him, who led an invasion against his own country, that's not going to turn out right.
It's not a good look, is it?
No, absolutely not. Right. Now, to clarify, when we refer to the Venezuelan opposition, we should not reduce it to Guaidó.
Of course not. It's a broader.
But that happens all the time.
He's a figurehead at the moment.
This is very important because, again, we haven't heard the voices of sectors of the opposition who are critical to Maduro, but are as critical, if not more, of the kind of options that Maduro, that Guaidó, and what critics of Maduro call the far right-wing sector of the opposition.
Yeah, and also we have not heard the voices of those who are under house arrest or in prison.
Of course not, but of course not, and that's a fair point.
For being opposition.
That's a fair point. Yeah. But you could actually give word to those who are not in prison, who are in the opposition, but who are not falling for the tricks that Guaidó and his wannabe masters are trying to play.
But let me come back to you, Vladimir. How significant do you think it is? Because I found it very intriguing how Guaidó was suddenly recognized, not just by the Americans. That's fine. You understand the Americans are coming from a particular position. But how the many EU countries fell into line, and, Latin American countries as well. That did give him a certain momentum and heft. Did that give him something which he basically didn't deserve in terms of the support he has in the country or his real potential to bring change? I don't know.
An unknown figure now becomes a rallying point.
Yes.
There is a mixture of things that I would say explain that. Desperation, people just are looking for a solution. They want someone with credibility. 2017, you had, 200 young people dying in protests, politicians leading people on the streets to die and be killed by security forces. All those politicians, or the majority of them, got discredited because they either left the country, then they stopped the protests, they promised people things would change, and they didn't. So most of them got discredited. Guaidó himself in 2014 was one of those demonstrators. His image hasn't been tainted by traditional politics.
Could you
as
tell us
well.
more about what kind of demonstrator was Guaido, the kind of group he belonged to, popular will, the fact that they are connected, they have been linked to the so-called guarimbas, the fact that it is known
Tell
that they
us
have
what the
been...
guarimbas are, because not everybody here knows who the
Well,
guarimbas
these are violent hubs of protest. You know, not only the violence is coming from all sides here,
Okay,
and the
but
far
let me-
right wing have been linked to this kind of violence. You know, the burning alive of protesters, pro-Chavista protesters in the
Hang on.
streets,
Protesta.
Earths in the plural,
No, no.
and people
No, no.
decapitated
Okay,
and so
hang
on
on,
and so forth.
hang on.
So-
I'm going to come to you in a minute, Anna Vanessa. Let me finish your point, Vladimir.
So my point is, Juan Guaido belongs to a party which is led by a man called Leopoldo Lopez,
Yes.
the opposition politician. By the time he was arrested for charges that he says are trumped up, I'm not going to stand there and defend
Sure.
him or not, but I'm just going to say what he says.
Yes.
He was the leading candidate in the polls.
Yeah.
He could have won an election if it would have been free and fair. The argument that some people would make in Venezuela is that he could have been a president if he would have been elected, and because of political vendettas, he was eventually put in jail.
Sure.
The government, let's balance it out, the government says he was behind violent acts and the guarimbas my colleague here mentions. Does Guaido represent all of that? Again, I go back. This is not about ideology. You cannot blame people following Juan
This
Guaido.
is an ideology.
Sorry, can I
These are
finish the point?
facts.
Let me
Absolutely.
finish, yeah.
You cannot, in my view, you cannot blame the people for supporting Juan Guaido because of whatever his party have done. They are trying to find a solution to the problem they have, which is I can't feed myself 3 times a day.
Yeah. Okay, you wanted to come in there, Anna Vanessa.
Right. What Oscar was saying about burning Chavistas protesters. No, we have to be very careful about how we tell the story here, because there's a major problem in Venezuela right now with news and the access to news. Is that the government, since Nicolas Maduro started, the government started either buying or shutting down thousands of free media, news channels, radios, and right now there is no official or let's say traditional media here in Venezuela, local media in Venezuela that you can access to this, to understand what's going on. So basically Venezuelans have turned to Twitter, Facebook, social media, and international journalists here and international media, those who have access to it. So we have to be extremely careful about that because it's already complicated enough to, say things like they burned in 2017, opposition members in a rally burned a Chavista protester. That didn't happen like that. It happened in the middle. Of course, I'm not justifying the fact.
Well, I was there. I
course.
saw it. So.
Oh, you were there?
Yes, I
Okay,
was
you
there.
What did you
explain-
see?
okay.
Okay, let me come back to what did you see?
I saw the
What did you
guarimbas.
see?
Actually, the British public saw it because they were presented a clip on Sky News in which the police is passing and a bomb explodes. That bomb, I was there. We were the group of journalists
no,
were
I'm
there.
talking
That
about
bomb,
the man who got
that
burned.
bomb
So
was,
you-
pla-
So that's
was,
not the same
You
was
saw
incident.
it's a different incident.
and that
So
bomb was exploded by precisely these
So
groups.
you
That's
saw
a
a
different
bomb
incident.
explosion. I think it's a different incident. Is this a different incident, Anna Maria? Anna Vanessa, sorry?
It's a different incident,
Yeah.
and that, of course, that did happen, and the burning of this man, of course,
Also happened.
Did happen,
Of
yeah.
course.
It I'm not denying that. If
Right.
you can,
Yeah.
So what happened there was that this man was in the middle of a group of very violent, angry protesters. And he started saying things about the government. He was not a protester itself. He was a man that was actually just, discussing with some of them. And one thing led to the other. And this was in the middle of the lynching crisis situation we had in Venezuela. Nothing like it before. We never seen, maybe in the 90s, we saw something like that. But it happened in different states in Venezuela.
Right.
And at least 100 people were lynched because people were sick and tired of them, of there no being justice in the country. So what happened basically was that someone said that he was robbing another person, and the word spread, and in the middle of chaos, this atrocious situation happened, and this atrocious act happened.
So it did happen, and it was the one person. It was an individual act. And we have also seen protesters, anti-government protesters. I mean, I did a story on this last week. Killed by the FIAS, which is a kind of what would you call it? Some people call it a death squad. Some people call it.
It's a death squad. It's police special forces.
It's a special force.
Yeah,
I think that we're going to open this out now. So we've got our lovely audience here, and we have the lovely Austin with his lovely microphone. So if anybody wants, now what I would say is ask questions of the panel. Please don't rant and make statements, because I'm really horrible to people who rant. I give you the death stare and you won't enjoy it. So the rest of the audience will, but you won't. So do we have any questions, or is everybody stunned by the erudition of the panel? I'm going to go over there first, and then I've seen you, sir, as well.
Hello, Elizabeth from IFEX.
Yes.
I just want to go back to what Vladimir was saying about the people. It's surprising to me how fast the narrative of the Venezuelan agency, of the people who have been protesting for years, has been lost. How can we recuperate that? How can we take off all the layers of geopolitical ins and outs and all that and go back to what the people are saying?
To what people are saying. Yeah. But, I mean, as ever, that's always very complicated, isn't it? Because people say more than one thing.
Yes.
And different people say different things. So how do we do? I think we do that by reporting normally, don't we? We just go out and ask people, but
I think it's giving a voice to the people and just getting a notion of what does it mean to be day by day in a country like that. And the amount of stories of people around the country are not necessarily related to political parties or any of that, but it's just it's ordinary life that you hear in any other country take for granted. It's just gone away.
I mean, I think that, in a sense, I can, if I will abuse my position as the chair, because I can do it and nobody can stop me. When I was there 2 weeks ago, I went into a hospital.
Dictatorship.
It's a dictatorship. No, it bloody well is. I went into a hospital 2 weeks ago, and we went in very quietly because you're not supposed to film in hospitals and so on. We went into a ward which was just appalling, and we interviewed a couple of people with their families who were there. Lady who's suffering from diabetes and there's no insulin, and it was pitiful. And then we thought, well, we've probably been enough here, and we left and we went down the corridor, and then somebody came herring after us and said, all the other patients want to tell you their stories too. And it was heartbreaking. And we went back into the ward and we interviewed the other patients and their families, and everybody had a story. And the wanting to talk to the foreign journalist was an act of desperation, because what was going to help them? And actually the most painful thing was talking to the doctors. And there was a doctor, he didn't want to go on camera, but he brought down 3 vials. He said, these 3 vials, I can treat 3 women with AIDS, but I've got 15. And then he had 2 vials. He said, and these 2 vials, I can treat 2 babies who are getting AIDS transmitted to them from their mothers. But I have a lot more than 2 babies. Who am I going to treat? And so I feel that was the sense I got of what it was like. That was the sense of what it was like to be a doctor in Venezuela, in a public hospital.
If I may.
Yes, go for it.
It is true, as you say, that very often in our narratives we lose view of the agency of people. There are people within Venezuela trying to recover or reaffirming their agency. There are those, for instance, who in the platform, the Citizens Platform for the Defense of Democracy, are mobilizing themselves, trying to use the Constitution. There are forms in the Constitution that would allow for a consultative referendum. They're trying to use that in order to call for a consultative referendum on the question of elections. So there are people in Venezuela who are also trying to mobilize, and we should not deny their agency.
Okay, gentleman there.
Good evening. First of all, thank you for the panel. It's been a very interesting conversation. My name is Sabra Ahmedi. I'm one of Britain's youngest imams, and I'm from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I belong to a registered charity called Humanity First. For me, one of the issues here, one of the biggest issues is these civilians or innocent people who are suffering and dying. And you've got parents who are giving their children away because they can't afford to feed them. It's heartbreaking. Yeah. So being part of a registered charity, what can we do to try and help these individuals who are innocent in this situation, in my opinion, to try and resolve the problem which they have in regards to medication and food, etc.?
Yeah, see, that's a very good question, because and there's something which we haven't come onto, which is the politicisation of aid. So I'm going to come to you, Anna Vanessa. So we see aid as a huge political tool at the moment, and the gentleman here has made a very good point. You know, here we know all about these people who need help. What is the best way to help?
Well, I mean, I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but one of the best ways is to really be informed of what's going on, and that is very difficult here. I mean, don't take this for granted at all. It's very difficult to find the right people, the right NGOs. There are serious, there are that don't want to be political, that they don't care if it's against Nicolas Maduro or against Enrique Capriles or Juan Guaido himself. I mean, they just want to get the aid to the people and the information right to the world so that everyone knows what's going on. That would be the first part. I mean, just be very informed on what's going on to avoid, you know, what Oscar was actually saying, this kind of misinformation around the idea of the crisis. And also, there are many NGOs and many people who are fighting for this to happen, and they are not political at all. Susana Rafali, for example, it's one of the people that I am sure, you know, can help everyone that asks to canalize they're willing to help. There are many hospitals that need help and that I know are receiving aid from abroad. And there are many also, there are a lot of under the table that, you know, that go under the table NGOs or group of Venezuelans in different countries that are actually canalizing the aid and the donations to each to JM de los Rios, which is a children's hospital, or to different children's hospitals. I mean, I myself have my godson, which I love so much. I found him in one hospital, in the Central Hospital of Venezuela, and he was about to die. He was malnourished. He had scabies all over his skin, and I took him out of there, and he's right now with a group of nuns in the port of La Guaira, in the port of Venezuela, and in the coast. And he's there, and they only treat children with special needs. And, you know, I mean, through a lot of people are wanting to help, and I am sure there's a lot of people that would help others try to, as I said, figure out how to do it.
Okay,
it's a very quick point on that, because what he's saying, so every time I put out a news report about what's going on in Venezuela, people then write to you and say, and surely to you as well, how do I help? How do I send people like that? But the problem you need to realize is that there was a man, I did something about a mother who gave away her children, and there was a man coming to me and saying, he's a banker in the city and I really want to do this, and can I send just money? I said, it's not that easy. You just can't transfer funds to Venezuela and give them to someone. That doesn't happen. There's a black market rate, there's an official rate. If you transfer £100, that's going to reach them in £1, let's say. Can I give that to an NGO? There has to be NGOs who are outside, who are legitimate, who are gathering money, and then have a way of taking that aid back to Venezuela. It's incredibly complicated route.
But Vladimir, the NGOs who we know of here, you know, Save the Children, Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, are they operating in Venezuela, or are they not able to operate in Venezuela?
Some are directly. Some are indirectly. Some who are less. So the Jesuit Church, for instance, is doing some stuff. There are diaspora organizations in touch with groups, but it's not as simple as Oxfam, Save the Children, and others, or the UN. In the hospital that Vanessa was saying is, like, groups of mothers come together and form a group, and then they're receiving aid to distribute it to other mums.
But what about the Red Cross or the International Red Cross? I mean, I know there's two Red Cross. You've got the Federation of Red Cross Organizations, and then you've got the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Well, that's the point I was going to make. I mean, my suggestion would be go through the channels that do work in countries such as ours. One first very good candidate is the Catholic Church. It does have the effective network that will get the aid, and it has a way of getting things done with the state.
So that's through Caritas.
The other thing is, let us remember that the government has accepted aid which it perceives as not being weaponized. And let us also push to the side, or let us not fall for some kind of white savior syndrome. So we can also work through the United Nations. Those agencies are working there. They can
UN
do some work.
Children's Fund, UNICEF, Children's Fund. Yeah, you were making a point, and then I'm coming to the gentleman at the back.
Hello, guys. I am Amazonia. I am from Venezuela. and I am working with a charity here. That
There you are. You're the lady we need to talk
yeah,
to.
exactly. Healing Venezuela. We are doing an amazing job sending medical supplies to Venezuela. I am
What's
part
the name of your charity?
Healing Venezuela.
Healing Venezuela.
Yeah,
and are you a
exactly.
Christian charity? You through the church
No,
or anything?
we are
Or it's nothing,
nothing about that.
Not so, okay.
We are just focused in
Yes.
sending medical supplies to Venezuela. We are collecting money here in the UK, and we are collecting as well medical supplies here. You can check our website. I actually
Okay.
have the charity box
Well,
here.
that's fine. Well, you two should talk. Okay, it's a match made in heaven. You two should talk to each other afterwards. That gentleman in the back, I'm going to go to him, and then I'm going to go to other people. And anybody else who's interested, talk to this lady. And then maybe before that, is there anybody else who's doing charity work in Venezuela? Stand up. You are. Who are you with? Tear Fund. So you're helping Venezuelans in Colombia.
That's a very important point.
Very
It's
important
also
point.
that's the other way
Anybody
you can
else?
help.
I'm sorry, lady in
Demand
the
the
back, yeah.
governments of Colombia and Ecuador to help the refugees there.
Sorry.
They're not
yes,
doing
sorry, lady there. And you're Save the Children.
We're from Save the Children, working in Colombia,
Colombia.
but partners in Venezuela as well.
Oh, okay. So anybody who's interested in helping, we've identified 3 people who are doing work. So go and see them after we've finished. Yes, gentleman in the jacket.
Yes, I would like the view of the panel on the following propositions. First, did Maduro's term expire as a legal president in January?
Mm.
Second,
How much time have we got?
You've
Well-
got 30 seconds on that one because this gentleman has more
I'll give you the
proposals.
quick answer.
Yeah,
My
no,
answer,
well, hang on.
no.
Let it,
Yeah.
So did his term expire in January?
Yeah.
That's the
Thank
first
you,
one. Go on. How many more
Okay.
have we got?
second,
Yes.
if his mandate expired,
Yes.
then in light of all of the allegations against him and his cronies internationally,
Yes.
they are nothing other than a criminal gang.
Uh-huh.
So the question is, how do you, unless the army backs the opposition, how do you root out that criminal gang of the country?
Okay, so obviously you think it's a criminal gang. That's your opinion, which is not necessarily shared by everybody on the panel. Oscar, his mandate's up. He's a criminal gang.
very
he can
quickly,
bugger
and
off.
you know what I'm going to say. The premise of the question is wrong.
Yes.
Of course, the presidential term did expired. It is the case that there were elections. 61% of those votes went for Maduro. 31% of the people voted. If you compare it with other elections in that part of the world, that's more or less what you get in any part of the world. There are allegations concerning the Electoral Council, and those allegations have a point. That's important. But that does not mean neither under the constitutional law of Venezuela nor in international law that you can just go and declare them illegitimate and somehow root them out. That's not going to happen. There are ways, this is not me saying this, there are people, as I just pointed out, within Venezuela, people who are also critical of Maduro, who are proposing a way out within the constitution of Venezuela, this consultative referendum. And you have under the constitution of Venezuela, you can, if you get 10% of the signatures, you can mobilize that referendum. Given the kind of pressure that has now been built around Maduro, there are more possibilities now than there were before for that kind of mechanism to be effective.
Vladimir.
Legislation is interpreted in so many ways, so you're not going to get a yes or no.
No, that's
So
I'm
the
sorry.
main,
Yeah.
the main problem, in my view,
Yes.
Yeah,
that-
well,
in my view, that I think
it's
the
also a fact. It's not just interpretation.
Sorry, let Vladimir finish,
Sure.
please.
I think the main problem the government struggles with is that when it got re-elected, and I will use inverted commas, the company that was running the software for the elections said that at least 1 million votes were tampered with. So that is a major question mark for any elections. That company left the country in a hurry because they thought their safety wasn't guaranteed. So that is the main argument for why Maduro was not re-elected. Now, then you go into legislation about Guaidó saying it's his turn, he's the head of National Assembly, all of that. That is interpretations of laws. But I think the government really struggles with the legitimacy of their re-election.
I have to clarify a point that you made. Of course, you know that your view, the view you just have expressed, would be refuted by the international observers who were
There are no
looking
I
international
at
don't think
the.
it was a
There
view.
were-
I think it
there
was an
were-
There are no international
observation.
If I may, can
No,
I make my point?
No, because
There weren't
you
international
just said it was a
Could
view,
I
and
make
I
my
don't
point?
think Vladimir made a view. He made a point about this company, and I'd be interested to know about
Exactly,
your view
and that's where
your
I'm going.
interpretation of that, yeah.
So you should know that that view would be refuted by those who were observing the elections,
There weren't
including
international observers.
including the
weren't.
Spanish former president José Luis Zapatero, who came out and he declared the election to be fair. There is
did
a
he have a
three-lock system and so
particular-
on and so forth.
There weren't
Vladimir, you
international.
have to come back.
No, it's just
Well,
a very
they're
minor.
where?
So
Please come back.
in matter of fact, international observers were not invited into the election.
No.
There were invitations issued to people who were friendly with the government, and those
Yeah,
were called
exactly.
international observers, but they
Yeah.
were not.
So they
Including
were
José,
not-
including José Luis
Including
Zapatero.
José
So,
Luis Zapatero.
yeah, let me
All
come
right.
to
So
let me
the
come
Spanish
to
president is also a liar.
let me come to our friend in Caracas, Ana Vanessa. You wanted to make a point.
No, I'm just reaffirming what Vladimir is saying. There were not actually international observers. That's really not what was happening. And of course, I think the real issue here, it's not if Maduro terms expired or not. It's really if is it legitimate. I mean, with this huge question marks behind the 2018's election, is this something that would make stable a government stable? I mean, is this something that Maduro would want for his next 6 years in term if he got the 6 years in term? I think that's the really big question. But I just wanted to reaffirm what Vladimir was saying.
So
there.
you think that these were not sort of genuine observers? Right, we've got a whole. Everybody's putting their hands
they
up
were
now.
not.
Oh my God, they're all going crazy. Lady here.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times about there being a plan for military intervention on some scale prior to the humanitarian crisis being declared. And I was interested as to when each of you considered that Venezuela became a humanitarian crisis as opposed to political or human rights, and then what impact that has on how we view any kind of response in terms of backpatting or whether it's too little or too late.
Right. Okay. So so when do you think it became a humanitarian crisis, Oscar? I mean, I understand that this.
I haven't
this is a
used
bit
the term
fuzzy.
humanitarian crisis because that term has
Do you
a
think it is?
technical.
But
that
do you
term-
think it is
I
a
ha-
humanitarian crisis?
That term has a technical definition under international law.
Sure.
And it triggers a series of juridical mechanisms that have to do with the responsibility to protect doctrine. So as an international lawyer and an international mediator, I cannot use those terms loosely. I have made it clear that, to my mind, there is a clear humanitarian problem in Venezuela. There are 2.4 million people who have crossed the border. The things you have witnessed, the things we have heard, all those things are real. And it does no one any favors denying that. And it is a problem when the government seems to deny that.
Which they
That
still
is-
do.
Which they do. That is a huge problem, and one must be critical about that.
Why do you think they do that?
Well, obviously because they know they are losing their political capital. It is the case that if you went to elections now, everybody in Venezuela will tell you they doubt that either Maduro or Guaido could win that election. Certainly, there is not just despair but anger towards the government. That is very real, and there is no way denying that. But of course, the problem here, and you pointed to that problem, is the politicization of a humanitarian crisis. What Washington has done, and this is something that we should be and can be very critical, because our governments here and in Washington are complicit in that. They have tried to weaponize the humanitarian mechanism so as to get towards a moral justification and the juridical case towards a responsibility to protect base humanitarian intervention.
But this is a very complicated thing, isn't it, Vladimir? Because I think that one can see, I mean, I'm using the term as a lay person, a journalist uses it, a humanitarian crisis. I saw a humanitarian crisis. And yes, I do understand this issue of the politicization of aid, which you think, well, that isn't, the International Committee of the Red Cross is very reluctant to get involved with this American thing because aid has been politicized. So I'm not sure where one goes with that. I mean, how do you see that, Vladimir? It's very difficult, isn't it?
It is incredibly difficult, but what do we stay on a debate on Twitter or on social media? Do we stay on the debate on media and journalists with comments, or do we just focus on people not being able to get medicines or buy things they need? That is my main issue. That again, I go back to my first point. Right, sure, let's talk about this has been politicized. What does that mean then? I think us as journalists, we've got a duty to report what's going on. The real problem here is not whether the aid is being politicized. The real problem here is that people cannot feed themselves in the country with the biggest oil reserves in the world.
Yep, that's a very good point. And I'm going to what are you telling me? We've got to shut up.
No, can I ask a question?
You're abusing your position just because you're holding the microphone. Okay, do we let him ask a question? Go on, ask a question.
It should be a less contentious point, but just to ask what the challenges are for reporting and the media landscape specifically inside for Venezuelans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let us take that to Ana Vanessa. The challenges for reporters and the media landscape in Venezuela, that's a very good question. Give us a bit of a sense of that.
Yeah. Well, they're huge. They're huge. But yesterday I was discussing this with a colleague that reports in different countries in Africa and said, this is nothing from in comparison what I have to live with. And I'm sure, if you come, Venezuela is very complicated. What you see outside, then you come here and you say, I see people, hanging around and going to restaurants, and there's not actual war like like the rest of the media are showing me, and that is true. But then again, for example, you can't report. I've done several articles and I haven't signed my name on it, and these have been articles that I've been working on for months, and I didn't sign them because my name on it would mean a very high risk for not only for me. I'm the least of the worries. It's my family. It's what we've seen the government and Nicolas Maduro's government do to journalists that they don't really like. We have the example with Jorge Ramos, who was just kicked out of the country. I myself had a problem with former Minister of Food, which I made several questions, and he didn't like it. So they hacked my Facebook and started publishing my face on different official Twitter accounts of the ministry, and saying, look for this person because she is trying to go after the minister. So that makes it really, really hard. But still, there are so many journalists here, local, foreign journalists here in Venezuela doing their jobs. So the thing is that with Venezuela, you always find your way to survive every situation. That is how Venezuela is. Even if you're not Venezuelan, you get taught this by the country. You manage your way out of complicated situations, and this is one of them. And we're managing, but yes, it's very, very complicated.
Can I just add, sorry, Lindsay, just a quick point to what she was saying. Challenges like I've been stopped several times whilst I've been reporting in the country. I'm forced to delete what I've had in my cards just because I was filming a queue. That's just ordinary stuff. Yeah. I have a friend of mine who
that's just a good day, and that's
exactly.
That's
so that's
just a good day.
All your work. Okay, well, sorry about that. I have a good friend who was flying a drone over a demonstration in 2017, and he was put in the political prison for 3 months. And there was a judge who put a release order on him to release him after a month, and they kept him for 2 more months in that cell. So the lawlessness of it is those challenges. I go back to Venezuela, I'm not going to get deported. I'm going to get put in jail if I piss off the wrong person. And will I be freed through due course of law through a lawyer? I don't know. So that's the kind of risk that you're facing on a daily basis. And then there is a challenge that you reported the story, you've bylined it, you put your piece out, and then I'm listening to my mum, I haven't got antibiotics, what do I do now? So that's a challenge on a personal level
and
as well.
Tell us a bit about the Venezuelan media, because one thing I heard was that the Venezuelan state media, they just didn't mention Guaido at all. And suddenly I watched the television while I was there, and it was a bit of an alternate reality, really, because I had seen a lot of opposition supporters on the streets, but I didn't see them on Venezuelan television. Ana Vanessa, tell us a bit about that.
No, that's something you're never going to see. The state media, it's basically completely detached from reality. They don't even try anymore. And this is this hurts so much, as a reporter, because even though you can be critical to maybe a rally or demonstration or whatever, but your job is just to show it. name it, if it's pro Nicolas Maduro, if it's pro Juan Guaido, you have to show it. And the fact there are so many journalists letting this happen is just hurtful. Really, it's very sad. And no, you're never going to see something about the opposition on the state media. Actually, when the 2012 election happened with Hugo Chavez, one of the main things they discussed before the election was that the opposition had to have time inside of the state media. I mean, that's a point of discussion. That's how far they can go. And right now they don't talk about Juan Guaido, although they do sometimes to call him, maybe to make fun of him or just to call him a terrorist, or if they want to point something at him. But there have been many local journalists being fired from other news channels bought by the government because they said Juan Guaido was the interim president. I mean, that's how they can get. That's how bad it can get.
Very good. Okay, so right, the staff have had their say. Now we're back into the audience. I'm going to go to this gentleman here, and then I'm going to work my way back. There's a gentleman here in the front.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. Am I right in saying that Marco Rubio posted a tweet that compared the death threat basically of Muammar Gaddafi?
He did post. He posted two weird pictures of Muammar Gaddafi, sort of in his just before his death throes, and that was interpreted as being a
I just find it
death
interesting
threat,
because I'm from Iraq originally as well, and I was just seeing, is there any kind of comparisons that could be made? So if a military intervention was to take place, will it end up with the same result? And if a military intervention,
we're very hypothetical here, aren't we?
well, if a military intervention is being seriously considered, I think it should be considered what the outcome and effects would be.
Yes.
And if there was a military intervention, how could it ever, if any, could it be successful?
I'll be very quick. I don't think there will be one, but if there will be one, or if there is one, I think it will be a complete disaster.
Yeah.
There is a very good piece by Adam Isaacson. He is a critic of Maduro, and he plays out exactly the kind of war scenarios that would happen in case of a military intervention, all of them disastrous.
Right. I mean, I think that you also, this is, I think that Oscar has made this point, but you do look back, to Guatemala in the 50s and 60s, and Arbenz and Arevalo, and you look at El Salvador and Nicaragua and so on in the 80s. I mean, there is a long history of disastrous intervention.
We have the exact same people behind those death squads
Elliot Abrams.
posing as champions of democracy and human rights trying to liberate Venezuela.
So, but maybe the world has learned something from the invasion of Iraq. You never know.
But I do find it interesting because
I
mean, very similarly, when the Iraq invasion, when the build-up to the Iraq invasion was taking place, you did have people saying, "I don't care if it's Sharon or Bush who's leading the country. We need to get rid of this madman
that's absolutely
because
true.
of all these, the sanctions, the killings, etc." And so it sounded like it was very similar. And again, maybe people on the ground would like an intervention if it meant that there would be regime change.
I think that's a really, really good point, because when I was in Iraq at that time, and absolutely, my Iraqi friends all said, we don't care if it's Bush or Cheney or who the hell it is, we've just got to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Nothing could be worse than this.
But it was worse.
That's what they found later. So that's absolutely, your point is well taken. Right, what else we got? We've got a lady at the back, and then we've got a couple of people there. We're going to go to this lady, and then we're going to that gentleman and that lady. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nicole from the LSE.
Yes.
And my question is, seeing it over the weekend, a lot of the army generals and army officials decided to support and recognize Guaido. Will this increase the prospects for a more peaceful transition, or does this not have any impact considering the vast number of army officials in Venezuela?
Yeah, because you've got 2,000 generals, haven't you? Well, what do you think, Ana Vanessa? There were a few defections at the weekend. Do you think that makes any difference or not really?
I think we have to wait and see what's if they're really making a difference. I do think this is something that was expected, but I also think that the opposition, the Venezuelan opposition, was expecting a little bit more soldiers, more generals, just jumping onto the idea and supporting Juan Guaido. So I think it's way too early to know for a fact if this is actually, but definitely, sure. I mean, I think it scratched a little bit of the reality the troops are living, because remember, the Venezuelan opposition has been saying that the military, the armed forces are not the top high-ranked generals that we see around Maduro on national television. are those who they're trying to get and to reach, are the troops, or the other generals, other commanders of troops that are living the same situation as the rest of the Venezuelans are living.
Yeah, one of the things. So one Venezuelan said, who I was listening to was saying, that they're not. That there's no way that the military is going to go over to the opposition. But there could be a coup against Maduro. They could sort of give up on him. And then somebody else was saying to me, no, they're all trained by Cuba. They're all, full loyalists. There's no way that's going to happen. I'm just interested to know how you would interpret that.
I just think that the people who command the army or command the main military forces, probably those of them are still publicly expressing their support for the government. Some of them still. Some of them wanted on money laundering charges still, so where are they going to go? They can't go anywhere really. Yeah. But rank and file, those are the ones who probably deserted over the weekend. You have about 60 people who are not leading troops, people who are not have positions of power to sort of change and tip the balance one way or another. I think it's incredibly difficult because also the government has done for years a big effort in paying extremely well some of those people. It's done a big effort to try to make a cohesive force that is incredibly politicized, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way. I'm saying it more in a. I went to a parade a year ago, and they just chanted about revolution, revolution, revolution. When it's very political what the military became in the last 15 years. So they're a very cohesive force. Rank and file probably suffering, probably relative suffering. But it's at this point, I don't think the military are at that situation where they're just going to give up.
Right, okay, fine. We've got some more. I said there was a gentleman here, yes, and then we were going to go to a lady back there.
What happened to the $20 billion?
Yeah, what did happen to the $20 billion? It's the $20 billion that Vladimir was... Which particular $20 billion?
I was just wondering if there's any evidence of the role of Western banks, lawyers, accountants...
Oh, the Bank of England you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
You're talking about the Bank of England?
No, the story you told about these $20 million disappeared out of the
ones that were stolen from Cadivi. No one knows.
No, I didn't mention that. It was Anna Vanessa.
Oh, that was you. Anna, tell us. Yeah.
I mentioned 100 billion.
Knows.
Yes.
Nobody knows.
No one knows where they are. No one knows where they are. This was publicly said by former Minister of Hugo Chavez, a man with great power, and they managed a lot of things for Hugo Chavez. And he said they were lost, literally lost. No one knew. They didn't have a track of what happened to those $20 billion. And this was recognized by Nicolas Maduro starting his first term in office. He said that he was going to go after the ones who did it, that the corruption was not going to be tolerated. And yet, here we are wondering the same thing as you are wondering. I mean, where they are, we really don't know. Of course, as any money laundering case, they are not going to be in one specific account right now. They're just, around there or, in big houses, mansions all over the world.
Let me just jump in very quickly so I can just answer because, sorry, I'm really sorry.
Then we'll come to you.
When Hugo Chavez created a fund, which then was given $100 billion, infrastructure projects were approved. There was an attempt to build a new train in between two of the biggest cities in the country, Caracas and Valencia. Yeah. There was a new train developed in between the suburban areas of Caracas, called Valles del Tuy, and the city. There were houses. There was something called Mission Houses, Mission Vivienda, which built a lot of infrastructure for poor people in different parts of the country. Sure, but you see, some of that became deteriorating as time went by.
But money was spent on those things, and those things did help.
Money was spent on those things, absolutely. But
even if it wasn't properly accounted for, those things which helped the poor happened.
Yeah, but was all the money spent on that? That's the main thing.
Okay, Oscar, let me come to you on that.
Thanks very much. Actually, there is people within Venezuela, and you can find those videos yourselves on YouTube. Beginning with the former Minister for Communities and Culture, who would tell you that a debate must happen in Venezuela about precisely the kinds of measures and the monies that were spent. Why is it that reserves were not, hiked up when the prices of oil were up, and so on and so forth? Those are debates that the Venezuelans themselves are having. Now, you wouldn't have those kinds of debates if you lived in a dictatorship. But they are having those debates. So let us not deny the agency to the Venezuelan
Can I ask
people,
at the fora?
if I may.
I want to know, I'm interested in what you're saying. So I'm interested to know a bit more about those debates and tell us a little bit about how those debates are happening. What are the fora in which those debates are happening?
Well, some of the debates are happening before the media, which is why I said that you yourselves can find those clips in alternative media outlets. Those debates are also happening within circles. I attended one myself, which I referred to in one of the barrios. That agency is there. Now, that goes to the second point, a point that you made very well concerning the role of the army. There are two problems here. On the one hand, there is indeed a sector of the army which is political. I mean, this is not ideological. This is a historical fact. A revolution, whether we like it or not, did happen. It is still happening. Some might say that it has stalled. Some others in Venezuela say the revolution has been betrayed. But that's also a point that we should consider, because it is also the case that there is in Venezuela, within Venezuela, a power dynamics, a conflict. Let me be very old-fashioned and piss you off once more. There is a class war happening in Venezuela. And that explains precisely the divisions within the army. On the one hand, there are sectors in the army, you know, the high officials and so on, who are invested economically in maintaining the government as it is. As you mentioned, they have control over food distribution. They have also been given contracts, you know, in the oil industry and so on and so forth. So you wouldn't find there the motivation to just let go. But others might. And this is part of Washington's plan. You know, one of the possible scenarios would be to divide the army and provoke a coup. But you must consider what the consequences of that will be, since there would not be a monolithical coup against Maduro. What you would have is a civil war.
Can I ask you about so just tell us a little bit before I get back to questions. I'm interested in this issue of class war within the army. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that? Do you mean because the rank and file are, you know, their families are hungry and so on, so that's the class war? I don't completely understand.
Well, something about armies in Latin America, they tend to be very different from in terms of class composition as they are here. Here you have the officialdom is usually, you know, middle upper class and so on and so forth. That's not the case in Latin America. There is also a very long history of progressive political leanings within armies. So it's not just the case that they have been all of a sudden brainwashed and they have all gone political. So you see conflicts within the army concerning precisely the class positions and the kinds of economic interests that they do have. But this is my point was also a wider point about Venezuelan society. There is a class war, and part of that class war, you know, expresses itself precisely in the kinds of, you know, internal economic warfare that has taken place.
But is there a complication now in the class war because so many people who are poor and had previously been supporters of Chavez are no longer supporting the government? So is that a sort of a complication, it's like within a class war?
Well, not just now, before. Of course, class wars are not something that, again, sets one monolithical sector against another monolithical sector. We should not read history as if it were a Western. This is not cowboys versus Indians. This is not a black and white situation, as my colleagues have pointed out correctly. What you have is precisely those kinds of divisions. And of course, if you cannot feed your family, your support you know, falls down. At the same time, you see and you will find, and I have found people, and you can yourselves find them because you know, that information is accessible out there. You would find people who would be critical of the government, who would you know, express their rage about their situation, and still would say, would tell you that they were empowered, that they felt empowered by the process. As my colleague just pointed out, it is important to distinguish the process as a whole from what has happened during the Maduro administration.
Okay, we're going to take we've only got 5 minutes, blimey. So, we had a lady at the back. Have we still got, no, there was a gentleman, but there was a lady at the back. No, she's given up. Let's take this lady over here.
Hi, thank you. Esther from Tier Fund.
Yes.
So, given this is a chronic and an acute crisis, doesn't look like it's going away, what would you say is the outlook in terms of the flow of people leaving Venezuela? Which routes are they likely to take, and how are they going to be received or continue to be received in their host communities? Thinking of Colombia, thinking of Brazil.
Yeah.
We're working particularly in Barranquilla on the Atlantic coast, so interested to know about that. I'm just anecdotally, friends in Peru are already complaining about all the Venezuelans arriving and taking their jobs because they're so well qualified. So I'd like to hear a bit about that.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to take a couple more points, but that's the point about the number of Venezuelans leaving and whether we're going to see more leaving. Let's take another 2 points. We're going to take this gentleman, and then we're going to take this gentleman. Yeah.
Thank you. Theo from Birkbeck. I just wanted to pose a question, really, and address one of the points that was raised earlier, which was this is not an ideological issue. I find that a difficult position to hold, considering it is, I mean, based on this conversation, it's a very heavily charged political situation, and aid itself is always political or economic, invariably at least. So the point which I really want to ask, do we not lean ourselves towards saying this is not a political crisis, and then we endorse someone coming in from the far right because we just want anything more than what we have?
Who's we?
I would suggest that it's the general narrative that's within.
No, there's no general narrative. We have conflicting narratives. So I don't know who you're we.
In this room, we have conflicting narratives.
As we have in the world and as we have in Venezuela. So who's your we?
I would say we being the US and the UK media.
The US and the UK
to be driving in one direction, which is towards expelling the leader, but without really thinking about the follow-through consequences. And my question is, do we not then push ourselves towards a situation when we've just created a good and evil situation, and we're pushing it out?
Push it as good and evil. Okay, very good. And we're going to take one more point, and it's going to be from this gentleman here.
Would Venezuela be in this terrible situation if Chavez hadn't died?
Oh, now that's a very interesting counter. That's a kind of, what if Hitler sort of, or what if David Cameron hadn't, would we be in this situation if David Cameron hadn't had the referendum? Would we be in the situation if Hillary had won? We're in a sort of major fantasy world here. So I am, Anna Vesa, you have a choice of questions. You can either answer the question about what's going to happen with the outflow of people, or you can say, is there a danger of Western countries, pushing towards, black and white, good and evil, and that distorting everything. Or you can have your counter-history question. What would have happened if Chavez had not died? Or you can answer all three. Go for it. It's your last chance.
Is that with me? Because I lost
Yes,
you
that's you.
Oh, okay.
That is you.
Sorry.
You can answer all of those questions or none of them.
Oh my God. Okay. I'm gonna go for the last one because this is something that I've been thinking about and discussing, and I'm gonna talk about facts. And experience tells me that Hugo Chavez was capable of resolving very complicated situations. And even though things started with him, I mean, the crisis, the economic crisis started while he was alive and ruling. The truth is that it got worse once Nicolas Maduro started in power. So, if you go to the facts, Nicolas Maduro has not been able to really handle well, although he has he's right now in power and he has maintaining power. He hasn't handled things like Hugo Chavez did. So I asked this to a former Chavista, actually a former minister of Hugo Chavez. Do you think this it would have happened something like this if Hugo Chavez was alive? And he said, no, definitely not. I mean, Chavez would have managed the situation, with grace as he always did. And I kind of agree. with him, actually.
Okay, that's very interesting. It would not have happened. Go on, which one of those three or all three are you going to take?
All three.
Go on, go for it.
Let's begin with the counterfactual.
Yes.
I would agree with what has just been said. There was a very interesting rapport between Chavez and the process and the people. It is the case that actually he was on the defense from the very outset. Again, I mean, this is not just something that happened just now. At the very moment that the process of the Bolivarian Revolution first and then the coming to power of Chavez happened, especially after his radicalization in the wake of the 2002 attempted and failed coup d'etat.
Yeah.
There you go, that's a fact also. At that point, it was very clear that there were ways in which these problems could be managed. He was always on the defense. Now, you must also take into account that the geopolitics of the region changed as a whole, which is the answer to the better question that we haven't posed here. Why now?
Yeah, that's a very good
part
point.
of the reason is because the allies in the two main countries involved here, Colombia and Brazil, changed.
Yeah.
Former Liberal President Juan Manuel Santos would have never gone for anything of the sort, and he was a critic of Maduro. And clearly, if you had Lula da Silva, who was put into prison so that he couldn't win the election, by the way, that wouldn't have happened. You would have had a very different dynamic of forces, which is why the previous advisors to Trump, people like General McMaster and others, did push back when Trump proposed the very same scheme back in 2017 or even before. Now, as to the second question, you notice that I have not used this idea of a non-ideological point. There is nothing more ideological than saying that there is something that is non-ideological. There is no way out of a political situation. Everything we do is political, and I am very suspicious of this idea that you can, position yourself on some sort of neutral ground. That is a complication. I understand why my journalist friends must, make that claim or feel that they must make that claim, but since I am not a journalist, I don't have to make it. I think that non-ideology position is totally ideological, and yes, I am indeed coming from a political position which I have not hid at all.
Yep.
And to the question, I think that's a very important question. Something concerning refugees in other countries. Something we can do. And this is something that I, my friends, and others do as citizens of Colombia, is demand of our government to put its money and its practice where its mouth is. If they are, as they have been, criticizing Maduro for gross violations of human rights and for producing a humanitarian problem, then, which they call a crisis, then they should be complying with their obligations under international law and under the Constitution, which they are not.
So they are not providing the aid which is required.
Last Saturday, if you moved from the concert, the Branson very, very amusing concert, and you went to where the refugees are located, you would have immediately noticed that they will tell you that they are not and have not been receiving any aid whatsoever. And this is very problematic, because these are Venezuelans who can be helped. You cannot blame their situation on Maduro or whomever. Not only that, phenomena of xenophobia, which you don't see very often in Latin America, are now beginning to emerge. And they are already being used and politicized and weaponized. Clearly, the case in the Brazilian border is this one. Remember that what you have in Brazil is not your, middle-of-the-road moderate conservative in the presidency, but a clear neo-fascist.
I'm going to close you down there because we've over time. But Vladimir, can you come? Black and white refugees Hugo Chavez alive.
I'll
Go
try.
on, whichever one you want.
I do think more people will leave because I think the economy in Venezuela is sustained by remittances. And people don't just leave because they got a relative kidnapped, but a lot of people just cross the border to get some foreign currency, hard currency, and try to send it to someone back or take it back. So will that be streams, millions? Who knows? But I do think that as long as there's a black market economy, that will probably drive people abroad. Colombia, other places,
Right.
who knows? My point about ideology is just that, do we talk about whether socialism works here, right now? Is that what we should talk about? That's my issue with it. Or is the story that I met a mother who's given away her kid because she couldn't feed him? So me as a journalist, and this is my personal view about it,
Yep.
is the suffering of the people is the real thing. We can debate socialism separately. We can debate whether that applies or not. This is a country with the biggest oil reserves in the world, which has had an influx of money for the last decade at least. How come it came to this? That is the debate that I think we should be talking about. How did it come to this? And I'm really against that view. If I'm on the left, then I cannot criticize when a left-wing government does bad. If I'm on the right, I cannot criticize when the right. Bloody hell, I'm Vladimir. I grew up in a left-wing household. I know what socialism is. I went to Sandinistas rally when I was 3. I know what ideology is. My point with Venezuela right now is that it's not about debating socialism. I wish Trump wouldn't speak so much about Venezuela. I wish he would shut up, because it's not about him either. It's about the people. That's my personal view. Will Hugo Chavez have saved the country? His charisma got him out of a hole so many times. I think he would have had a big challenge in unsustainability. When he came into power, he created something called Misión Barrio Adentro, which is inside the slums. These were quick emergency pods inside slums where people, if they were shot in a barrio, which quite often happens, you, instead of going all the way to a hospital and trying to get your relative dying on the way, you would go to a pod inside your own barrio, get treated, primary care, and then you would go there. Hospitals were in a dire state in 1999. They are worse now. At the time, that made sense as a temporary measure. What happens is that became permanent. Most of the policies that were applied were temporary solutions parallel to the structure that existed. The money was used to create parallel structures. And then when the size of the state grew enormously, oil prices came down, people siphoned funds away, all of that, whatever we can explain happened, then you've got a huge state structure, not the income to sustain it, and what do you do now? Hugo Chavez, if he would be alive today, he would be dealing with that. So I think, would he have had the charisma? Maybe, because he did. And he was an incredibly popular leader, no doubt. But would he have been able to? I don't know. I would say it's 50-50.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it here. Let me thank Ana Vanessa Herrero. Thank you so much for joining us from Caracas. Let me thank Vladimir Hernandez and Oscar Guardiola
Thank
Rivera.
you.
Thank you very much.
Indeed.
And thank you. Right.